The next stage of the election campaign kicked off in Kazakhstan. The registered candidates have been officially allowed to start campaigning from March 26. Who will the Uzbekistan citizens vote for? Will the current head of state run the office? Election in Uzbekistan is being observed by nearly 300 international observers. Error, accident, or malice? Why did 150 people crash flying from Barcelona to Dusseldorf? A 320 airliner crashed in the French Alps. How do people live in the Southern Kazakhstan? What achievements are they proud of the most? What other plans? The president paid a visit to the most populous region in the country. The people of Singapore say goodbye to the beloved leader of the democratic world. Kuan Yew has turned the poor island country into the largest commercial and financial center in Asia in a few decades.
Good evening, I'm Rahim Ashakbayev, and this is Kazakhstan Weekly, where we summarize the major local and international news of the past week. Our tonight's guest is a known public figure, Adil Akhmetov. Mr. Akhmetov, I'm glad to see you.
Good evening.
Kazakhstan has officially released the names of the presidential candidates. They are the incumbent president Nursultan Nazarbayev, who was nominated by the Nur Otan party, the candidate from the People's Communist Party Turgun Sizdikov, and the self-nominated candidate Abelgazy Kusainov, the head of Kazakhstan Trade Unions Federation. In general, the Central Election Commission received 27 applications from contenders. 24 of them didn't meet the requirements stipulated by the legislation or were refused from the further participation in the election campaign. Let's see the electoral process in our story.
On March 25, the Central Election Commission has completed the registration of candidates. The next day, the election campaign has officially started, and it will last until the end of the day on April 24. Then, a day of silence will be declared before and during the elections. According to the legislation, the Republican budget must cover a part of the expenses of the candidates. The state guarantees an equal allocation of funds to promote their election programs through the mass media. The amount that each of the candidates will receive according to the corresponding resolution was adopted by the CEC. A 15-minute speech on the national television will cost 5,250,000 tenge, 10 minutes on the radio, 200,000 tenge, and publication of 2 articles in the print media, 810,000 tenge. In addition, the candidates will be allocated with funds for rent, printing of promotional materials, and transportation costs. The total amount is more than 7 million tenge, or about $38,000. The accreditation of the international observers to the elections is still ongoing. As reported by the CEC on March 25, 35 observers from the OSCE, ODIHR mission and the mission of observers from the CIS and 10 foreign countries were accredited. In addition, there are 98 accredited foreign journalists. They will have the right to observe the elections throughout the country.
So, Mr. Akhmetov, the state will cover part of the cost of the pre-election campaign. What is the world practice?
In this respect, I would like to give one perfect example. When President Barack Obama was elected in the United States as the president, I participated as an observer this process. And very interestingly, his contender was Senator McCain. And of course, in the United States, like in very many other countries, part of the expenses, for example, is provided by the state. But very surprisingly, Obama didn't use the state's money. He simply used the internet, and through internet he addressed the people, the voters, to help. Just $5, $10 each, and he accumulated 3 times or 4 times more than the budget of the state. And he won because he was supported by everybody, I would say, by the politicians, by the journalists, by the scientists, by everybody, every citizen.
It is called crowdfunding.
Yeah, because his slogan was, "We should change America." Mm-hmm. And he won.
Yes, we can.
And in our country also, for example, part of the expenses are covered by the state, and part of the expenses come from the sponsors. likewise, like in everywhere.
A few hours left before the presidential election in Uzbekistan. Today at midnight, the day of silence was declared when any campaigning or propaganda becomes prohibited. The polls open on Sunday at 6 a.m. local time. Those Uzbek citizens who have the right to vote can give their voices for the future president. There are 4 candidates.
The presidential election in the Republic of Uzbekistan will take place on March 29. The observers' mission from various international organizations have arrived at the invitation of the Uzbek Central Election Commission. About 300 observers from foreign states participate in the observation of the presidential election, as well as heads of diplomatic missions of South Korea, China, the United States, and major European countries. The OSCE and the CIS missions have been accredited to observe the election, as well as the mission of international organizations, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, and the Association of World Election Bodies. 4 candidates are running for the snap election in Uzbekistan. The main contender is the incumbent President Islam Karimov. Besides Islam Karimov, who has been nominated by the Liberal Democratic Party of Uzbekistan, there are Hatamjan Ketmanov, People's Democratic Party of Uzbekistan, Akmal Saidov, Democratic Party Milli Tiklanish, National Revival, and Nariman Umarov, Social Democratic Party Adalat, Justice. In 2008, the parliament abolished the opportunity for independent candidates to run for presidency. Islam Karimov, as a presidential candidate in Uzbekistan, remains faithful to the former course. In particular, he proposes to retain a non-aligned status for Uzbekistan, as well as to prevent the deployment of bases of foreign military on its territory and not to let Uzbek troops to stay outside the country. He stated that under his leadership, Uzbekistan will not join the Eurasian Economic Union or the Customs Union in their current forms. The incumbent president's election program includes the implementation of large investment projects in the industry by 2020 that is worth $38 billion and the program of production localization, as well as application of support for small and medium-sized businesses and employment. Other candidates have focused exclusively on domestic issues, promising Uzbekistan the regulation of prices for goods and tariffs for utilities, state control in the pharmaceutical market, the fight against falsification and distortion of history, and limiting the use of genetically modified organisms in food products. According to the CEC of Uzbekistan, about 21 million people will be able to take part in the election. 14 district election commissions have been formed, more than 9,000 polling stations created, including 44 abroad. To win the election, candidates will have to win more than half of the votes, while the turnout must be at least 33%. The CEC promises to announce the preliminary results of the election on the 30th of March. As with previous election in 2007, the present election will also be held without exit polls. They are banned according to country's electoral legislation. The electronic system that monitors voter turnout will also be utilized at the press center of the CEC.
So, Mr. Akhmetov, in your opinion, what are the advantages of the election program of the current president and his political opponents?
Of course, the program of the incumbent president, Karimov, is preferable compared to the other programs of the other contenders. And Karimov's program includes such projects, for example, to bring in investment and in the industrialization of the country, and to support small and average and small businesses, and very many other sectors. As for the programs of the contenders, they are mostly focused on the internal issues, see? And that's why I think Karimov will win, because his program is preferable, and it is, I think, good for the well-being of the voters. By the way, 21 million voters are expected to come to the polling stations. It's quite a huge figure. And I'm quite sure that Karimov, the incumbent president, will win the election.
A plane crash in the Alps has claimed the lives of 144 passengers and 6 crew members of the Airbus A320. 3 citizens of Kazakhstan and a woman who was born in the country were on board. The plane en route from Barcelona to Dusseldorf crashed in a remote mountainous region in southeastern France. The most experienced experts are involved in the investigation of the accident. The International Aviation Committee and the crashed aircraft manufacturer, Airbus company, offered their assistance to the experts.
3 days of mourning have been declared in Western Europe. The EU member countries commemorate victims of the Germanwings plane crash in the French Alps. The Airbus A320 of the German company, en route from Barcelona to Dusseldorf, disappeared from radar screens on March 24. 150 passengers were on board, mostly citizens of Germany and Spain. People from 15 other countries, including Kazakhstan, were also among the passengers. The Minister of Foreign Affairs of Kazakhstan has reported that 3 citizens of Kazakhstan, Joly and Adil Umankulov and Ayjan Isengalieva, were among the deceased in the crash. They were one family. They went to the Iberian Peninsula for vacation. Ayjan Isengalieva was Deputy Director of Mining and Processing Plant, Kazzinc. Her husband and son also worked for Kazzinc. Adil Imankulov worked in production, and Yerbol was director of the smelter. They bought tickets to the ill-fated flight just before the departure. Initially, the family planned to take another flight via Frankfurt. Famous opera singer Oleg Brizhak, originally from Kazakhstan, was also killed in this horrible accident. Since 1996, he had been a soloist at the Deutsche Opera in Dusseldorf. The opera singer was returning to Germany after a tour in Barcelona. Over the past 3 days, about 600 French rescuers have been flying over the crash site. The airliner has crashed in the rugged terrain, which greatly complicated the work, but rescuers have managed to find 2 black boxes. Studying the data of the flight recorder, the only means of communication between the pilots and dispatchers on ground, experts have determined that at the time of the accident, only one pilot was inside the cockpit. The aircraft commander came out of the cockpit and then could not get back inside. He knocked on the door and even tried to break it, but the co-pilot did not reply. The Marseille attorney Bryce Robbins said on Thursday that the actions of the co-pilot of the Airbus A320 could be interpreted as the intent to destroy the airplane. The co-pilot began deliberately losing altitude. After the September 11 attacks, the cockpit doors have multi-protection features. No one can open cockpit doors without a secret passcode. In addition, pilots can lock the door from the inside even if the correct code has been entered. According to the Germanwings company, the plane sent no distress signal during the 8-minute descent. Relatives of the killed passengers have arrived in France for identification. A special crisis center was opened where professional psychologists work with the relatives of the deceased. The crash of the Airbus A320 killed 150 people and plunged us into mourning. We will do our best to support the families of the victims, but first of all, we need to understand the reasons that led to this tragedy. Our embassies in Germany and France are in constant contact with the officials of these countries to identify and transport the bodies of our citizens back to Kazakhstan. We have established contact with the family and relatives of the victims, and now we are working with them. In such cases, the identification of the bodies and the debris takes some time. As soon as we receive this information, we will immediately, without delay, inform the relatives, and further decisions will be taken.
So, Mr. Akhmetov, there are different versions of what happened, even the version of pilot suicide, and everyone is interested. Is it possible to prevent such kind of tragic situations?
In this case, of course, it was impossible to prevent this situation. But I would say, generally, before the flights, all the pilots should undergo very strict control. Their health conditions, especially from the point of view of psychological point of view. But from the mass media, we find out that when the commander left the cockpit, the second pilot just locked the door from inside, and I think he purposely began to descend, and it brought to the tragic situation. And I think this was a mistake, and from the mass media we again find out that this co-pilot, I mean the second pilot, was suffering from mental disease. Even he shouldn't have been led to this flight, because from medical point of view he should have stayed at home. But in spite of the fact he was led. This was a big mistake, I think. German German, for example, Avia commissions began or has already introduced new regulation that at the same time, for example, the cockpit in the cockpit there should be 2 pilots at a time. In this case, 1 pilot has left, and the second pilot mentally, for example, he was, I think, under depression, and he did it purposely. He committed suicide, but his committing suicide didn't belong to his own self, but it touched the other passengers. All of them were killed, and this is a very tragic situation. And from now on, I think we should take into consideration and learn lessons from this kind of tragic plane crashes.
Mm-hmm. So, Mr. Akhmetov, one more question. It happens so that our citizens get into trouble while abroad. What sort of support can they expect from our diplomatic services?
In these kind of situations, for example, our ambassadors abroad and our consulars there, consul, for example, servants, they usually help our citizens who, for example, undergo this kind of situation, and they also help the citizens who lost their loved ones. And these kind of measures are being taken by the embassies of Kazakhstan, for example, in Spain and in Germany and in France. And they are doing their best to help the relatives of the people, 3 citizens of Kazakhstan who lost their lives.
Last week, the head of state paid a working visit to South Kazakhstan. President Nursultan Nazarbayev started his trip with the most populous region in the country, South Kazakhstan region. In Chimkent, he even managed to take part in the celebration of Nowruz. Watch the next story to learn what the president has seen within the 2 days and what prospect does the region have, according to him.
The territory of the South Kazakhstan region is 117,000 square kilometers, or just 4.3% of the country's total area. However, it is larger than Australia, South Korea, or the United Arab Emirates, for instance. In addition, it is the most populous region in Kazakhstan. It is a home to about 17% of the total population of Kazakhstan, so it is no coincidence that the president, Nursultan Nazarbayev, has paid a visit to the South Kazakhstan region and stayed there for 2 days. On the first day, he went to the Ordubasi district, to the country's largest greenhouse complex. A giant tent covers 11 acres of green space. To build it, farmers spent 2,600,000,000 tenge. The state had allocated the largest part of the total amount as a loan. In winter, farmers collected 25 tons of cucumbers per day, and in summer, twice as much. Moreover, the entire production has a sign Eco Standard, which stands for Ecologically Clean Product and guarantees safe consumption. The products are grown in special containers made of coconut fiber and watered by purified water with nutrients. This saves resources such as water for irrigation and fertilizers, for example. 30% of products are exported abroad, and the president instructed the management to increase the output and to be more active on the market of the new Eurasian Economic Union. Indeed, as noted by the President Nazarbayev, there is no other region in Kazakhstan that would possess such natural conditions. On the second day of the visit, the president took part in the event dedicated to Nowruz. 11,000 Chimkent residents and districts welcomed Nursultan Nazarbayev. The region started the spring equinox celebrations 9 days before the 22nd of March, and each day has its own name, such as the Day of Cleansing, Wealth, Prosperity, Charity, Honor, Joy, Memory, and so on. According to Nursultan Nazarbayev, the way Nowruz is celebrated in South Kazakhstan region is a good example for all other regions. Next, the president visited the National Tennis Center, where hundreds of children train on 12 outdoor and 4 indoor courts. The wide range of services, including almost all types of heart surgeries, are provided in the Clinical Research Center for Cardiac Surgery and Transplantation. The president saw the operating rooms, intensive care units with modern facilities, with comfortable medical floors. The Jambul residents, along with other patients from different regions, have been getting their medical care free of charge in the center from 2013. The president also participated in the forum dedicated to the Year of the People's Assembly of Kazakhstan in Taraz. Some 3,000 Jambul residents attended the event. Today, the region is a home to 87 ethnic groups. There are 25 ethno-cultural associations. The local schools teach in 7 languages: in Kazakh, Russian, Dungan, Uzbek, Korean, Turkish, and Uyghur. The president emphasized that peace and harmony is the golden heritage of the state, which should be passed on from generation to generation. Summing up the results of his work and visit to the region, Nursultan Nazarbayev outlined the key points of the future growth.
So, Mr. Akhmetov, in your opinion, how dynamically now is the southern region developed?
I would say southern regions of Kazakhstan are developing very rapidly and very dynamically. Especially, I would like to underline the development in the southern Kazakhstan region because this is the region densely populated. You see, 70% of the population of Kazakhstan live in this region. And this region is very, very important from the point of view of supplying fruits and vegetables not only to Kazakhstan but also to the neighboring countries, because this area, this region is very active in, for example, developing agriculture, and especially in growing, in supplying vegetables and fruits to all the regions of Kazakhstan. And that's why not only agriculture, but I would say that southern Kazakhstan region is very entrepreneurial, very active in business, in small and average business. And in cotton cluster is being developed there. And this area is very active. Besides that, southern Kazakhstan's capital, Chimkent, is absolutely a new city now. It has developed, it is new center, cultural center. And our president from time to time visits there, this area, and now our president's working visit. And at the same time, our president participated in the celebration of Nowruz there. And besides that, our president visited Jambul region, and not only Jambul region is also an agricultural region, but medical cardiological center is very active there, and our president participated, visited that facility too. I would say our president also participated forum, because this year we are marking this 20th anniversary. And from this point of view, this visit was also very, very important, I would say.
Singapore says goodbye to country's first Prime Minister, Lee Kuan Yew. He died on Monday at the age of 91. He headed the Singapore government from 1959 to 1990 and was called the founder of Singapore's economic miracle. Singapore has become a financial hub of Southeast Asia under his leadership.
When Lee Kuan Yew assumed office, Singapore, a country with no natural resources, was one of the poorest in the world. And in just a few decades, the state has turned into a global commercial and financial center. All that was achieved by attracting foreign investors and redirecting the country's economy to the high-tech field, also the fight against corruption and organized crime, and investments in education of country's citizens. The Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew managed to keep the English language and the British legal system while pursuing tough reforms in a country with the Chinese, Malay, and Indian population. Fines were imposed even for slightest violation of public order. The death penalty was inflicted for drug offenses. The inevitable prosecution for corruption, the presumption of innocence in respect to government officials, was sacrificed to economic prosperity, and as a result, today the country ranks 7th in the global ranking of perception of corruption. Lee Kuan Yew was a winner of many awards. From 2005, he was an honorary doctor of Moscow State Institute of International Relations. From 2014, he was an honorary doctor of the Diplomatic Academy of the Russian Foreign Ministry. Lee Kuan Yew was also awarded the Japanese Order of the Rising Sun, a British Royal Order of St. Michael and St. George, Malaysian Order of the Crown of Johor, the Order of the Royal Family of Brunei, and other awards. The President of Kazakhstan sent a telegram of condolences over the death of the great politician. Nursultan Nazarbayev emphasized the contribution of Lee Kuan Yew in building strong friendly relations between Kazakhstan and Singapore. A farewell ceremony was held in the building of Parliament. Thousands of people came to say goodbye to Lee Kuan Yew. The coffin was taken to the Parliament, accompanied by a guard of honor. Funeral will take place on March 29. They will be attended by the President of Indonesia, Joko Widodo, South Korean President Park Geun-hye, the Prime Minister of Thailand, Prayut Chan-o-cha, Myanmar President Thein Sein, the Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi, and the Australian Prime Minister Tony Abbott. Our whole family was deeply saddened by yesterday's news. We wanted to send him flowers, but it's too late. His death has affected all of us. Without Lee Kuan Yew, we wouldn't have become who we are today. He was a man who had a lot of ideas for the growth of Asia. He was the founding father of Singapore. Thanks to him, Singapore is in the way it is today. He was a great leader of Asia.
So, Mr. Akhmetov, quite often Lee Kuan Yew was accused of neglecting the so-called democratic values and the establishment of the authoritarian regime. Do you agree with this opinion?
Partially yes, partially not. First of all, we must pay attention to the economic situation of the country. And from economic point of view, Singapore is one of the leading countries of the world. And during those years, I mean 31 years of premiership, he was the head of the government. And he created this country, absolutely he changed this country. It was one of the Asian very poor countries. But as soon as he became the Prime Minister of Singapore, he introduced a lot of economic and political reforms, and Singapore is now one of the leading countries in the world. Of course, he is criticized sometimes by the human rights point of view. But for Lee Kuan Yew, discipline and order was number one. Economy was number one. Only then policy and democracy. And by the way, he was one of the best friends of the United States, and he, during his premiership, he visited the United States several times. And when he visited Washington, D.C., very many presidents, I mean the American presidents and foreign office, for example, leaders, always queued to meet him and to listen to his advice, you see. And now this country is led by his son. He's already in the power, Prime Minister of this country during already 11 years. And the tradition is continued. In spite of the fact that even I read his books, one of his books is titled "From Third World to First: History of Singapore," and in his book he writes, "For me," he says, "for Lee Kuan Yew, discipline and order is number one." And he says, "I am criticized. I know that I am criticized by outside critics. But for me, it is more important what my own people who gave the reign of this country will say about my actions. And actions always speak louder. And what he has created is very important, I think."
So you think goals justify the means?
Yes, absolutely. He is one of the great leaders of the world. And by the way, he is highly respected by our president, see? Mm-hmm. And very recently, I published an article titled "Lee Kuan Yew's World," because what triggered to write this article, the reason was I received a book from Harvard University. Three scholars of Harvard University, they are the leaders of the research centers. They published a very interesting book, Lee Kuan Yew. I read it in English, and I couldn't help writing an article. Mm-hmm. And it was published in Kazakhstan. And I think he deserves these kind of things.
Thank you very much, Mr. Akhmetov, for being with us tonight. I hope to see you next week in our program.
Thank you.
Finally, here is a brief preview of the events of the coming week. On Wednesday, April 1st, Paris will host the Global Forum on Development of the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development. On April 3, Bishkek will host a session of the Council of Foreign Ministers of the Commonwealth of Independent States, CIS. We will discuss these and other important events in our next program. Thank you for watching. Best of luck and goodbye.